I will put my tabernacle among you. I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. We'll sing to God's praise the hymn 371, the White Book, number 371. We love the place, O God, wherein your honor dwells, the joy of your abode, all earthly joys excels. 371, as Jane begins to play, let's stand ready for singing together. Now I'll read to you from the book of Leviticus, and tonight chapter 26. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, chapter 26. Leviticus 26, verse 1. Do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove savage beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall by the sword before you. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall by the sword before you. I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. You will still be eating last year's harvest when you will have to move it out to make room for the new. I will put my dwelling place among you. I will put my tabernacle among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt so that you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with heads held high. And there we'll leave it for tonight. Well, tonight we come to this late chapter, the last but one chapter of the book of Leviticus. Sometimes subconsciously, sometimes more consciously, I've been looking for the climax of the book, the verses in which finally the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God, becomes the real tent of meeting where God meets with his people. I thought it was going to come in chapter 16 on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went through the curtain into the most holy place where God was. But when we got to chapter 16, the Day of Atonement did not read like the great meeting of God and his people. It didn't seem any more significant. Perhaps it seemed less significant than what we'd already read in chapter 9. The chapter 9 event sounds bigger, more the real thing to me than what happened in chapter 16. And then we came to chapter 23. Chapter 23 describes the different Sabbaths the Israelites were to now observe. And each Sabbath was, you remember, an occasion for great assembly, sacred assembly, solemn assembly, holy convocation around the Lord at the tabernacle. And it's in chapter 23, I think, more than chapter 9, more than chapter 16, that we find ourselves saying, oh, this is what the tabernacle is all about. The lives of the people of God must be punctuated with these Sabbath gatherings at the tabernacle around the Lord. And then we came to chapter 24. Chapter 24 seems to underline that truth. The 7 lamps in the holy place shine forward onto the 12 loaves. God is making his face to shine upon the 12 tribes gathered at the tabernacle. So having had chapter 23, the Sabbath assemblies at the tabernacle, this is what the book has been building up for. This is what the tabernacle is for. And then so beautifully underlined in chapter 24, the lamps shining on the 12 loaves. Expected then to find the last chapters to be a PS, that the book would now fade away. We found what we were after. But listen now to chapter 26, verses 1 to 13, or take a glance at them now. We've read them now, but you can see them in front of you. Verses 1, 2, and 3 are the Lord's conditions. Verses 4 down to 13 are the blessings which will come to you, the Israelites, if you keep those conditions. Verses 14 to 46 are what the Lord will do if you fail to meet the conditions So the conditions, the blessings, and then the judgments if you fail to meet the conditions. Now, in verses 1 to 3, you could say the conditions are all the laws of Moses, all the laws of God given through Moses. Remember, we're still at Sinai, all the way through the book of Leviticus. We don't move away from Sinai. If you want to know what happens between Sinai and the giving of the law and the promised land, you read the book of Numbers. But right through Leviticus, we're still at Sinai. God is giving his law, not just the 10 Commandments etched in stone, but all the laws, including the instructions for the tabernacle, and in Leviticus for the sacrifices and the priests. They're all coming from God at Sinai. And now the Lord says at the end of Leviticus, if you obey these laws, I will bless you. But this is Leviticus, and so he is thinking especially about the laws relating to the tabernacle and worship and God living among his people. So look at the conditions again. Chapter 26, do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves, and do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary, my tabernacle. The tabernacle is, the whole book, as you know so well now, is about the tabernacle. Observe my Sabbaths and have reverence for my sanctuary. Remember, every Sabbath in Leviticus is about gathering together at the tabernacle. Observe my Sabbaths, have reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord, if you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, and so on. Now, I want to devote our remaining minutes tonight to the blessings which God promises his people if they obey, especially if they do not worship idols and if they honor his sanctuary, the tabernacle, and if they honor the Sabbaths and gather around him at the tabernacle on those Sabbaths. So the blessings of these verses. Blessing number 1 is rain, and more grain and fruit than the Israelites will know how to eat. Verses 4 and 5. I will send rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want. You won't have finished sorting out the last crop, let alone eating it, when the next crop will be ready for harvesting. And that's the first blessing of the verses. Rain. More grain and fruit than you will know how to eat. Secondly, blessing number 2, no burglars and no murderers. End of verse 5, beginning of verse 6. He says, and you will eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. You will lie down and no one will make you afraid. You will live in safety, you will lie down, and no one will make you afraid, which I take to mean no burglars, no murderers. You won't need to lock your door at night. And that's the second blessing. The third blessing, no violent, man-killing animals. Verse 6, in the middle of verse 6, I will remove savage beasts from the land. I will remove violent, man-killing animals. I think that little sentence might be the biggest clue as to what is happening in Leviticus chapter 26. Do you remember Isaiah chapter 11? That reference might not mean anything to you straight away, but this is the section that begins, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, or you might know it in the King James. I don't, I'm reading it. And there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. It goes on, verse 6. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the hole of the cobra, and the young child put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. In the final analysis, Isaiah is describing heaven. And I want you to take what he says quite literally. There will be wolves and lambs in heaven, and the wolves and lambs will be eating and playing together. It's heaven. Now, back in Leviticus chapter 26, we haven't got to heaven yet. The savage man-killing animals have not yet become our happy, sociable friends. But they've been banished. God says, I will remove the savage animals from the land. In other words, Leviticus 26 is, if you like, halfway to heaven. You see what the Lord is saying. If you follow, if you obey, especially the Sabbaths, meeting with me at the tabernacle, I will make your land a paradise. I'll make it a restored Garden of Eden, a heaven. And that all came from that little clue there in verse 6. I will remove savage beasts from the land. But then think about the other blessings. Rain, so much wheat and so many grapes. You won't know what to do with them all. No burglars, no murderers. You won't need to lock your door at night. No savage animals. Can you see God is promising them a restored Eden, a halfway house to heaven. Just makes you think, our friends today in Britain, are we right to talk about importing wolves and jaguars back into England? Or do we say, no, that's heaven? Then we'll talk and play with the animals again. For now, we just thank God. It's a blessing from God that he's removed the savage animals from our land. Well, that was number 3 in Israel all those years ago. Now then, blessing number 4, no war. No war. Or even if another country invades you, you will defeat it easily. End of verse 6, verse 7, verse 8. He says, I will remove savage beasts from the land, and the sword will not pass through your country. You will pursue your enemies, and they will fall by the sword before you. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall by the sword before you. No war. But if an enemy invades, you'll defeat them so easily. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100, 10,000. They'll fall by the sword. Blessing number 5 is children. I'll give you children. You'll have lots of babies. and many of them will live to be adults. Verse 9, I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. My covenant with you. Remember what the Lord has said to Abraham. Look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Genesis 15, so shall your seed be, so shall your offspring be, like the stars you can't count. And now the Lord repeats that promise. He says, I will look on you with favor and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. The blessing of babies, of children who grow up to adulthood. And then he seems to repeat blessing number 1. Remember blessing number 1, more grain and fruit than the Israelites will know how to eat. Verse 10, you will still be eating last year's harvest when you have to move it out to make room for the new. I'll give you more grain and fruit than you know how to eat. The harvest will overwhelm you. I suppose he said it again because he's just given them the promise, the blessing about children. Blessing number 5, children. Lots of children. And that makes him, the Lord, Moses, want to mention grain and fruit because the two fertilities go together. They are tremendous blessings to any nation. I believe that still. Fertile soil and fertile mums and dads. They are two blessings which really make you think about God and seek God and worship God, perhaps more than any others. How does this seed turn into that? It's so beyond us, whether that's a cauliflower or a baby. How does this seed turn into that? It's so much an act of God and a drought, or either kind of infertility. It drives us to our knees. Although you do wonder, thinking about our own country at the present time, will drought, will not enough food, will a diminishing population, which is a real crisis, will it drive us to our knees? Perhaps we're past that now. But they ought to drive us to our knees. Those two fertilities are so important to any land. And here they're part of the paradise that God is promising his people. And then there's one more blessing, number 6, we can call it the presence of God. And of course, this is the greatest blessing, not even the two fertilities. I wanted to underline them because they're in our text, but I wanted to make them out to be perhaps more important than they are, because both fertilities have been so despised in our own land these last years. And I think it's a mark of how far we've moved away from the Lord and a mark of his judgment upon us, that the two fertilities have been despised. But, of course, the greatest blessing is the presence of God and the favor that comes with his presence. So verse 11, I will put my dwelling place among you, my tabernacle, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. If we haven't already begun to think about paradise and God kind of restoring the Garden of Eden, we have to think about it now, when the Lord says, I will walk among you and be your God. Remember the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And now he promises, if you keep my commandments, I'll I'll restore a paradise to you, and I will dwell among you, and I'll walk among you, and I will be your God. Of course, it's Leviticus. He's talking about the tabernacle. But you see why I'm thinking, oh, this is where the book of Leviticus has been coming all the time. The paradise which follows, when God in his tabernacle is among his people. The whole land will be Eden restored and heaven anticipated. Now I'd like to jump, as I so often do like to on these Wednesdays, to the present time. And it's not an easy jump any time from any Old Testament chapter to the present time, because Jesus Christ has come. But I think we can say, how many things am I going to say? I think we can say these 4 things. First of all, the complete fulfillment of Leviticus 26, verses 4 to 13, will be heaven, just like the complete fulfillment of Isaiah 11. The wolf and the lamb will be heaven. See, these chapters help us to anticipate what God has prepared for those who love him. And secondly, fulfillment does not begin when Jesus comes again, either of Leviticus 26 or of Isaiah 11, or of any part of the Old Testament. Fulfillment does not begin when Jesus comes again. It does not begin in heaven, if you like. Fulfillment begins when Jesus comes the first time. You know his words in Matthew 5 are so crucial. I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have come to fulfill. I've come to turn that bud into a flower. And fulfillment begins. It did begin when Jesus came to Bethlehem at his crucifixion, his resurrection, his ascension, the sending of the Spirit, all those great events rolled into one, that he was the beginning of fulfillment. We live in the day of fulfillment. But then thirdly, we need to say this. Well, I've worded it like this. I don't believe. And that's a bit of a cop-out. It means I'm not going to tell you exactly why. I'm just going to say I don't believe that any land this side of Christ, I don't believe any country, any land is going to be paradise. No country today can claim that Leviticus 26 is being fulfilled here or there. Even modern day Israel, I believe, can't claim that. The second half of Leviticus describes what will happen if Israel doesn't keep the covenant. I mean, we haven't read it, but do read it. If Israel worships idols, if Israel dishonors the tabernacle, the Sabbaths, the covenant was conditional. And Israel broke her covenant with God. And that means, looking back, we can see Israel isn't going to now continue to claim that our land is or becomes a paradise. And yet, fourthly, I believe that God meets with his New Testament people And from that meeting, that worship, that tabernacling, God tabernacling with his people, that from that there flows out paradise, the beginning of paradise, young heaven, even in this world, in Bradford. Wolves are lying down with lambs. So in the end, that is fulfilled literally in heaven. I want you to look forward to that. But there is some sense in which it is being fulfilled among the people of God in the Church of Jesus Christ today. Wolves are lying down with lambs in the Church of Jesus Christ. An uncanny harmony has begun, a miraculous harmony has begun. So, two passages, and then we'll close. Acts chapter 2, those verses, I think we quote them often from the close of chapter 2. You remember that 3,000 who woke up that morning, fully part of their corrupt generation, repenting, they're baptized. And then, verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. And that is just a very simple description of the people of God gathering, and God is among them. They devote themselves to the apostles' teaching, not meaning now to books of doctrine. There were no books. Not meaning even to their system of doctrine, but best translated, yes, the apostles' teaching. The apostles were the elders of that first church, and the church gathered and they devoted themselves to listening to the teaching and preaching of their elders, and to the fellowship. They gathered like that, to the breaking of bread, to prayer. This is a very simple picture of those believers gathering together in the presence of God, worshiping God. And then notice the paradise which flowed out from the gathering. Everyone was filled with awe, verse 43, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. And of course, because of that, by the apostles, we have to be careful then about just saying, same with us, but continue. Verse 44, all the believers were together and had everything in common, selling their possessions and goods they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily such as should be saved. Can you see the beginning of heaven? That touching God, theirs, they worshipped him together. Paradise flowed out. I'm not saying it was automatic. I'm not saying there weren't some real hitches and blights to the fellowship. But I think we can see a young heaven. You'll see more examples, but here's one again, one I think we know well. Ephesians 5 and 6. So Ephesians 5:18, don't be drunk with wine, instead be filled with the Spirit. And then verses 19, 20, 21. A wonderful, simple picture of the Church of Jesus Christ in song. worshipping God together. So be filled with the Spirit. And then we've said this a number of times, and I'm sorry just to say it again, but remember, these aren't new sentences now. These aren't new commands. There's one command, be filled with the Spirit, or be being filled with the Spirit. And now then, these are little branches of the command, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making music in your heart to the Lord, giving thanks to God the Father, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. They're all branches of the being filled with the Spirit. It's a wonderful description of the church singing the praises of God. And we could highlight any part of it, but notice the submission that's going on as we sing, submitting to one another. As everybody sings to God, and everybody sings to everybody else, and everybody listens to everybody else, and we're submitting to everybody else, and we're being filled with the Spirit as we sing. God is among his people. And then see what happens. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, verse 22. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Chapter 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord. This is paradise, but it's here. This is a paradise flowing out from a church meeting with God at worship. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And masters, verse 9, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them. Do you see that? Paradise, heaven. Leviticus 26 is beginning to be fulfilled. And then you bring a dog into your house, and the dog begins to smile and communicate and wag his tail and there's a bit of heavenly harmony in your home, an anticipation of heaven, and the budgie begins to talk to you, and heaven begins on earth. These little foretastes. Well, they're not automatic, and sometimes the harmony, it's going to take a being filled with the Spirit to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. But I think it's great to have before us what God is doing. That paradise has begun on earth among the people of God. And there we'll leave it for tonight. We'll sing, not just because we often do. I hope that's not why we sing, but we will sing 56. We'll stand and sing in the Black Book 56. May the peace of God, our Heavenly Father, and the grace of Christ, the risen Son, and the fellowship of God, the Spirit, keep our hearts and minds within his love. 56, as the piano begins. As the piano begins, we'll stand ready for singing 56. Please be seated. I wonder, Chris, would you